Welcome back to the library, dear wanderers. Today we're gonna head back to Library Wing 1, the Hidden Nest. Back to the first Oak's shelf, where we'll pick out the first work we see. This one was brought to the library by Punk Cat. Now without further ado, The Truth of Lies. It was dank and dim under the bridge, but he was used to that. Used also to the slow, mesmodic drip of water into the pitted concrete foundations. He picked listlessly at a scab on his scar-puckered forearm. The thick, grimy, yellowed fingernail caught the edge, lifting and releasing a gush of greenish pus. It itched, its trickling way down his coarse gray skin as he watched, resigned. It hadn't always been like this. He hadn't always been like this. Reduced to a shambling hulk, dressed in the cast-off tatters of the homeless. He was less even than them. They still held their humanity, their dignity. He held nothing but his existence, and that only because he could not die. They shunned him. Once, he had been glorious. Once. One long, glorious moment of glory. Perfection. For one long, yet never long enough, moment of time, he had had everything. But of course he hadn't really. It was an illusion. Like Midas, everything he'd touched had seemed precious. But the more he had, the less he had. He knew true loneliness now, like only someone who had lost everything could. How many bridges had he torn down in his quest for revenge? It was so many, across so many ages, he couldn't begin to count. It started simply enough. He'd been humbler then, a goat farmer. A man with a tongue and an imagination, a teller of tales that became taller with each addition. What they say about a lie, spoken often enough, taking a life of its own is true. And so his stories, his embellishments of the truth, his boasts of courage and invention became a truth of a kind, and he reveled in the adoration it gained him. It was foolish, whatever way you looked at it, to tell tales about the gods. To be fair, he hadn't started them, but he also didn't stop them. Instead, he embroidered and fluffed each lie so it sparkled like a precious gem-encrusted cloak. And then he wore them with pride. Oh, how pride always comes before the fall. A terrible, terrible fall. The gods, you see, have a sense of humor. They do not like braggarts. So they gave him everything he said he had seen and done, simply made all his lies true. He found himself with scars from battles he had only spoken of, treasure from mystical creatures bent on revenge and retrieval, women scorned and vicious shunning him and turning all other women from him. But the worst part of the curse, each lie he told after that to try and get himself out of the impossible places he found himself in. Each tiny little untruth left another patch of his skin as thick and rough as granite. It didn't take more than a double handful of decades before he was as he found himself now. Hunched, gnarled, and hideously ugly, and completely unable to die. That was painful, found knowledge. He'd been drowned, burned, beheaded, boiled alive. So many methods, and none had been more than an incredibly painful inconvenience. in his unwanted continued existence. The biggest irony was the gods were no longer around to see what they had wrought, to see just how low they had brought him, to see what they had created. He was another lie now, a fable, a story, a thing to frighten naughty children with. He lived under bridges and climbed out only to snatch another mouthful of food, another handful of cloth. He was so lonely. He even missed the goats. And with that sad story of why you shouldn't lie, we'll move on to the next work, brought to the library by Door Handle. Now, without further ado, All Aboard the Cyclops. Howard stepped out of his room and into the drizzling night. The raindrops were light, so he didn't bother buttoning up his uniform or putting on his hat. Making his way across the iron floors and past the floodlights, he approached the 4 men who were gathered beside the railing. 3 were in matching navy attire and saluted him as he grew nearer, while 1 was hunched on a large tarp-covered object, clutching his gray jacket like a cloak and shivering underneath it. One of the crew, a towering man with ginger hair, stepped forward and loudly said, "Good evening, Captain Trench." It was the owner of the same voice that convinced to come out here. Howard put on a stern face in response, trying to hide his exhaustion. He'd have to make this quick before it was past midnight.
"I'd say it's already night, but whatever. What exactly did you call me here on the walkie for, James?"
James quickly responded with,
"We've found someone in an escape pod, Captain. The markings indicate it to be one of our own."
Now, this was quite unforeseen. A military vessel stranded on foreign waters wasn't really a usual sight, let alone one that belonged to his own country.
"And where would this escape pod be?"
James gestured his hand at the other crewmen, and all 3 of them lifted up a small part of the tarpaulin beside them, revealing a small compact vessel, half his height and twice as long. It bore a close resemblance to an armed torpedo, the only difference being the small snout-like window and the large metal hatch on top.
"And our stowaway?"
Howard asked coldly. James marched towards the man in the gray jacket and patted him on the back.
"On your feet, soldier. The captain wants to talk to you."
The shivering man slowly stood up, revealing a head whose top was mopped with black hair, disheveled and curled up in a mess. There were large bags under his eyes, perfectly matching the utter lack of spirit on the rest of his face. It was the state of a man trying to recover from the depths of utter despair. Howard felt some semblance of pity for him, wondering on what kind of tragedy even befell upon him.
"What's your name, son?"
"Lisbon Newman, sir," muttered the disheveled man, "crewmate of the USS Cyclops."
"I see."
So he was from the submarine that broke off contact a week ago. There was probably a long tale behind it, but to question him now would be quite inhospitable. Howard pointed at the crewmates in front of him and said,
"Men, clean up one of our spare quarters and prepare a set of dry clothes for this gentleman. We'll be asking Mr. Lisbon and put this on our report first thing tomorrow."
2 of the crew nodded and headed off to the deck's entrance. Howard approached Lisbon, still shaking under his uniform, and placed a hand on his shoulder. Lisbon jolted slightly to the side, but slowly looked up to meet the captain's gaze.
"Rest easy, son," he said. "We'll get you back to shore in the morning."
Lisbon kept kept on looking down, but Howard thought he saw some life return to the poor kid's face. With a slightly better change in his voice, he uttered, "Thank you, sir."
Don't mention it.
A smile nearly formed on Howard's lips, for he could see that there was still a chance that this young man could return to a somewhat normal life.
I hope you don't mind, but I'm afraid we have to check on all your belongings,
he said, his gaze slightly wandering to the interior of the pod.
Mandatory protocols and all that?
Lisbon silently nodded with the strength of a quarter of a child. Howard didn't want to bear witness to it anymore and returned his gaze to James, asking him,
How many guards are still on duty? 7, Captain.
Less than a quarter. Would be a bit cruel to force them to another job after their shift. He also felt some kind of strange intuition about it, a feeling in his guts, as some would say. Something deep below his conscience told him that he had to take whatever was inside the pod, that he needed to at least see it to satiate his curiosity. It was never a choice to begin with.
I'll confiscate these belongings myself. They will be taken to the evidence locker on the first light of day. In the meantime, please escort Mr. Newman to his room.
Very well, Captain, nodded James. With that, he took Lisbon's hand and led him away from the deck. Howard waited until both of them disappeared inside the entrance and picked up the rest of the materials from the pod. Bottled water, oatmeal cookies, and a large notebook. Nothing too strange from an outsider's view. Carrying those miscellaneous items, he hurried back to his room, his boots slightly soaking the fine carpet layering his floor. He put the rations away on a silver platter, yet made sure that the notebook remained in his hand. He sat down behind his desk and propped his feet atop it. He inspected the notebook in his hand, a bundle of paper, slightly drenched at the edges, with a thin acrylic sheet slapped on both sides as covers. Surely there was something of value written here. Maybe an entertaining tale, or even some decent blackmail material. Howard convinced himself to stop fantasizing. That the true worth of this book could only be decided by thoroughly examining its contents. So he flipped to the first page and began to read. Wednesday, September 16th, 2020. This is Captain Jack Argylus of the USS Cyclops. I know logs aren't mandatory anymore, but I'm writing this just in case we don't resurface. It has been 3 days since the expedition to the Marianas Trench. 8 crewmen, 1 captain, and 1 second in command. Sent to investigate some unnatural signal from deepest point of the ocean. Would have gone back up an hour ago according to schedule, but unfortunately we face some unforeseen circumstances. Yesterday, everything, for the lack of a better term, went to hell. Within moments, the submarine was knocked out of its predestined trajectory, sending the crew rocking back and forth between the walls. The fuel was leaking, and the pressure hull seemed to be heavily damaged. The communication room got flooded and fried from the inside out. All the escape pods were somehow jettisoned straight towards the ocean floor, leaving us all slowly sinking to the abyss. If my math is correct and nothing changes for the better, we might just reach Crosscheck in about 5 days. I certainly hope that this vessel doesn't become our coffin. Thursday, September 17th, 2020. All right. Captain's log, second day. One of the crewmates, Lisbon, proposed a strange little idea that we could launch the torpedoes up to the surface to signal the Navy. It seemed quite outrageous, with most of us knowing that we are in foreign waters and that it might be mistaken as a war site, which is probably why Vince, my second in command, stepped up and scolded him for his decision, going so far as to tell him that he'd send him out the airlock if he proposed such an extreme plan again. That was a pretty harsh reaction, but maybe it was for the best. Starting a war wasn't really worth the risk. You know, something funny happened while I was on my way to my quarter. I just finished up a few repairs to the radar system with Vince and was passing the outer corridors, dimmed to save on the emergency power, when I saw some faint light passing outside the windows. I needed something to take my mind off our inevitable demise, so I shut off the rest of the lights lining up the corridor and looked back out. Then I saw it. Layers and layers of a monolithic city scattered throughout the ocean floor, stacked on top of one another and trodden with the large, luminescent marine life. They strongly resembled great towers, with their lowest foundations utterly swallowed by ancient yet blooming forests full of impossibly flowering trees. The weirdest part, the ones on top looked a bit like those apartments back in New York. God, why won't you just let me sleep? Friday, September 18th, 2020. Two of the crewmen have gone missing. Jim and Andy, the ones who were guarding the airlock. The crew are already shouting bloody murder, but Vince kept on suggesting that they simply got trapped in the sub's lower compartments. He even managed to gather 3 more of the crew, Andrew, Oliver, and Caleb, to start a search. Normally, I'd strongly protest against that, but I couldn't suggest anything else to alleviate the situation, so I just let them venture down. They just finished gathering some supplies and are about to descend in a few more minutes. It shouldn't be much of a task for them, but I still solemnly pray for God to ease their journey. Saturday, September 19th, 2020. Only Vince and Caleb came back. They said that nearly every room around the airlock are already submerged. Told me that they found lots of cracks forming in the walls every minute, and that the other 2 were swept by the current to the lower hulls, most likely drowned or crushed under the pressure. Even had to seal the remaining entrances to make sure the flood doesn't reach us. Fuck, this is seriously getting worse with each passing day. Sunday, September 20th, 2020. We've been compromised from the inside. There isn't much time left for me in this world, but I'll try my best to summarize everything. That morning I entered the dining room, being the latest one. As always, I was immediately greeted with the sight of 2 crewmen, Eggers and Tom, dead on the floor, surrounded by puddles of their own blood. Lipson was hiding behind an overturned table, his firearm drawn. If I'd focused on that one scene for longer than a second, I would have noticed the other 2 people on the far side of the room. One trudging with a limp in his left leg, while the other whipped out his own pistol and aimed it towards me. By some unknown instinct, my hand struck the breaker panel by the door, sending the entire dining room into complete darkness. I pulled out my sidearm and ran past the tables, desperately trying to remember the assailants' positions. The one without a limp wouldn't be trying to waste his bullets, and instead would try to reactivate the breakers or tackle me down and finish me off point blank. Thankfully, it wasn't the latter. One of them reached the breaker panel and reactivated it, while I was merely a meter away from him. I rushed forward and attempted to clobber him with the butt of my pistol. The assailant, who I saw in the limelight, was none other than fucking Caleb, hurriedly bent his arm with the gun at my direction. The shock of seeing a member of my own crew retaliating against me wasn't enough to overcome my will to survive. I managed to push my gun backwards, facing his eyes. I honestly don't know if it was either a slip of a finger or just my anger subconsciously rising up, for his own gun was triggered, and for a second, I could see his mouth wide open in utter horror. A final frame before the end of his life. Dear God, I made him eat his own bullet. Caleb's body struck down against the floor, the teeth of his mouth completely blown off, and a large hole carved through the back of his head. I was petrified on the spot for a moment, realizing that I may have taken another human life, which the other assailant probably took as a golden opportunity to finish me off. I saw him in the corner of my eye, stumbling forward with gun in his hand, but his movements were cut short by a gunshot which rang out from behind me, followed by him collapsing to the floor and screaming in pain. My head swiftly turned around, facing Lisbon, who had already emerged from the back of the table with his gun smoking and was now charging towards the wounded man. Vince, why? At full speed. In just a second, he was right in front of Vince and thrusted his feet against the fucker's face, sending the poor sod flying backwards and knocking him out. Lisbon then knelt down and started sobbing, asking me on whatever should he do now. I told him we should try getting answers from the bastard first, which he vehemently agreed on. We dragged him to the walls and tied him up to the railings with some spare rope. Deciding that our time was running short, I kicked him awake in his manhood. Vince was unsurprisingly coherent as he shouted profanities at me for several seconds. After finishing his small rant, I asked him about the obvious, on why he and Caleb killed 6 of the crew. The goddamn bastard tried to bluff out, saying that they only killed those 2 in the dining room. Obviously, I didn't believe that statement, so I told Lisbon to shoot one of the fruits of his manhood if the bastard were to try and make any more false answers. Hearing the threat, Vince finally complied and admitted the deed, said he and Caleb were just doing their job, and that their loyalty to this crew was a far second, vastly underweighed compared to their duty to humanity, whatever that entailed. At this point, I was already starting to question his state of mind, yet I let him run his mouth. He continued by saying that the rest of us should either kill ourselves off or accept whatever fate awaits us in the depths, pressing on that we had to die in the dark so everyone else can live in the light. I promptly told him to stop spitting out bullshit. That was the part where I should have stopped talking and shot his heart out. But alas, being the curious bastard that I was, I asked him another question, one that I should have stayed away from. Why are our cities under the sea? Hearing those words, he began to sob, which quickly turned into him screaming and laughing through the tears. Lisbon was physically aching to ask for my permission to use his firearm on Vince, and even I was tempted to shoot the poor sod myself, but before the both of us had the chance to do so, Vince bit down on his tongue, which instantly glowed red, followed by his entire body jerking inwards, almost as if his very bones were being sucked away to the middle of his chest. I don't really remember much about what happened next, other than Lisbon shouting for me to get back and an awful ringing sound that appeared out of nowhere, which was somehow followed by me lying on the floor screaming out all the air that filled my lungs until my throat began to bleed and my vision, slowly but surely, blurring out and shutting down. I must have been out for half a day, for when I regained my senses, it was already 6 p.m. I was somehow in the medical wing with Lisbon sitting by my bedside, somehow sleeping while doing so. I wasn't too intent to wake him up, so I tried to hop off the bed and get something to eat. It was only then I realized that my left arm and both my legs were gone. The stumps beneath my waist and left shoulder were flaked like papier-mâché. Dozens of small bone white shrapnel jutted out of my ribs, with more of those tiny patches of flakes surrounding each one. Understandably panicked, I practically shouted at Lisbon until he jolted awake, asking him on what even happened. He was unsurprisingly shocked as his rest was interrupted, yet managed to regain his composure and recounted on the previous events that nearly 100 of those white shrapnel shot out of Vincent's mouth, heavily maiming me, yet miraculously avoiding every part of his body. Vince himself was quite dead, his entire form boneless and deflated like an airless balloon, his skin wrinkled and twisted from all directions. Seeing my condition, Lisbon had tried to pluck some of the tiny shards out. His efforts had only resulted with the flakes crawling up my body even faster. I don't blame him for trying to help. The flake growth has currently spread to my armpits and down to my belly, crippling and snapping off the flesh along the way. It doesn't hurt, though. I just feel cold. So yeah, currently writing this with my remaining hand. The blood I bleed hardens and crumbles the second it leaks out. The flakes seem to be climbing closer to the center of my body. Lisbon already pumped me with the heaviest meds he could find, but they seem to be doing jack shit. The growth should reach my heart in about 14 hours, give or take. I don't know anything about the people that hired Vince and Caleb to doom us here, but whoever you are, fuck you, your families, and all you stand by. I'm sorry, that was quite uncalled for. They were all good people, including those two. At least, that's what I hopelessly want to believe. Anyways, I don't think I'll be leaving this place alive yet. I can make sure that at least one will be able to. None of the crewmates know, but there is a secret room in my quarters, able to be accessed through the egregiously large painting in this submarine's architect. Inside, there's a small pod, spacious enough for at least one person, but only used by the previous captains for sending very vital materials back to shore. I told Lisbon about it, seeing that he has the best chance of getting out of here. He seemed to already understand my intention and said that he might be able to alter it so it can transport a human back to the surface. He also correctly guessed that I wanted to be left here, so I assured him that taking me with him would do no good, and that he would only manage to bring my family a pile of ashes. The pod should be ready in less than 8 hours. Monday, September 21st, 2020. Today's my birthday. How fitting. About to die at the age of 45. I guess I should write down my apologies. To my wife Bonnie, sorry for being such a lousy and distant husband. To my little girl Penny, please forgive your father for his horrible excuse on why he was rarely home. To my brother Joseph, I'm sorry I didn't make it in time for your wedding. To my mother and father, Mary and Ryan, forgive your failure of a son, and thank you for bringing me to this world. To the good men and women in the army, I'm sorry I failed my mission. That should be enough regrets. Once I'm done writing this, I'll give this book to Lisbon, and hopefully to my family too. Then he'll put a bullet between my eyes and take the pod to the surface. I can only wish him luck on the way out. I'm dying, but I won't surrender. Farewell, ye good batch of humanity. May God bless you all. That was quite the interesting read. Howard put the notebook on his desk and cupped his hands to his nose. The night was growing short, and he'd have little time to put his mind to rest before he'd have to report all this back to the mothership. So he sank into thought, deep below his mind, to try and make sense of this whole ordeal. From a neutral perspective, the log held the impression of a madman that desperately tried to justify his actions. Argolis was quite respected among the ranks of the Navy, but the depths of the sea can change even the most iron-willed men. After all, talking about layers of sunken cities and bone-puking men whilst claiming that you were still sane was no easy feat. Though, on the other hand, if the events in the log were to be taken as fact, then it could only mean one thing. The Foundation hijacked the Cyclops. It was the only logical conclusion. All the intel that he had gathered for the past 2 years had revealed that the Foundation has put a disturbing amount of effort in filling the Navy's ranks to make sure the trench was never explored too thoroughly. His sister, who was far more knowledgeable in the anomalous field, regularly told him rumors about the very iterations of humanity itself. A few superiors of his, who were much more discreet in their approach, had passed cryptic ciphers in every private document that they gave to him, detailing confidential operations involving a certain geyser park. That Lisbon boy would probably be amnesticized once they sent him to shore. This log, once inspected by the authorities, would most likely be sent to an undisclosed location and buried until all that remained are ashes. He himself would be thoroughly inspected and quite possibly removed by the Foundation if they found out that he so much as glanced a small portion of the log's contents. Howard snapped back out of his hand and intently stared at the notebook on his desk. It was no wonder that the very words inscribed upon it could change the very truth of this world as he knew it. Would be a shame if it ended up in an incinerator. He had to keep it safe for the rest of the voyage, and find the nearest way once he was back on land. The 7th floor of his bedroom would most definitely suffice, though he'd also have to find someone else to safekeep it once he entered the library. The few names that immediately crossed his mind were Ellis, Cursive, Saintsburg, heck, even Cambarat would do. Whichever one that he encountered first shall have the honors. But for now, the only thing he could do was hide it from the watchful eyes of his nation's military. He reached down and unlocked one of the desk drawers, producing a large sheet of plastic, an unlabeled jar of ink, and an iron syringe. He began wrapping the notebook with the plastic sheet, trying to create something similar to a package, and carefully folded the edges to make sure that not even a pinhole remained for any air to escape. The end result was similar to a newly bought product from a bookstore, quite well done in his opinion. The next step was going to hurt like hell, but if he could finish this up quickly, then he'd be able to get a few hours of rest. He rolled up his sleeves and forced the syringe's needle to the vein of his arm, gritting his teeth as he drew out the blood until the syringe was halfway full. He dipped the edge of the needle in the ink jar and siphoned a fraction of its contents, filling the rest of the syringe. A quick glance, and it was clear that the process would be fast. The blood inside was already boiling with the ink, mixing together into some utterly hellish color. With that done, he raised his hand with the syringe above the covered notebook and pushed out the contents. The liquid that was ejected no longer resembled ink or blood, but some vile charred slime that could easily be mistaken for molten flesh. It immediately spread out and engulfed the book like some ravenous, formless beast, hastily sinking itself and the book into the surface of the desk, leaving behind a darkly taint across the wooden furniture. That was all he could do for now. Hopefully none of his supervisors noticed the slight change in his desk's color, or the faint but noticeable odor that now filled his room. There was only a single day left until he was back on shore, yet that amount of time seemed so distant now. Even then, he had high hopes that this was about to pay off just fine. The world would inevitably be uncovered, one truth at a time. And so, in countless universes, the Foundation remained indomitable and were continuously paramount and unstoppable in their one deed of prolonging humanity, repeating the same accursed cycle over and over again like a dwindling record until the degeneration of time itself. But not in this one. And with that lovely yet harrowing tale, we have reached the end of our time here today. Thank you very much for coming, dear wanderers. It has, as always, been an honor reading for you. Good luck out there, and I hope to see you all next time.